The co-sponsors here at Southwestern Community College of our Native American Society. I am so honored to share this time, this event, and this space with you today to see what traditions we bring together and to connect to our modern activities as Native Americans. So thank you for joining us for our event. I am a Cherokee Appalachian woman. My mother grew up on the boundary, and I'm Bird Clan. And so I'm very honored to speak not only from my biracial composition, but also I would like to speak on behalf of all of the people that cannot speak for themselves in relation to the issue of domestic violence. My younger brother, Sean Birchfield, works for the Cherokee Indian Police Force. He is the domestic violence detective. He was going to be with us today. He is a family court advocate, so he goes to court with the victims of domestic violence. And in his planning, as I talked to him yesterday evening, he's not able to join us because of a recent case of domestic violence on the reservation that ended up in a murder case. And so he's involved with that ongoing investigation. So he sends his positive energy and his blessing. And so I will try to present information that has been shared with me. This is not my academic specialty, but this information was provided by one of the domestic violence safe shelters and one of the directors, the Ernestine Walking Stick Shelter, which of course serves the eastern band of the Cherokee Indian, both here on the reservation and in the surrounding counties. So I'll share that with you today. First, I would like to invite you to think of a very painful topic, but a very somber topic. If you could think of maybe 3 times in your life that you've witnessed or heard of domestic violence. For some of those, we may have been involved in the occasions. For some of those, we may have heard the stories of either perpetrators or survivors. For some of us, we may have only seen it in drama, in situations where we're not familiar with the people themselves, but we see the scenarios either in popular culture, movies, TV, even videos, things such as that. So as we think back on these 3 incidents that involve domestic violence, and we survey our memories, I would invite you to please join me by paying respect and tribute to both the survivors of domestic violence and for the victims who were not able to survive, who have not told their story. So if you'll please join me in standing for a moment of silence. And so we stand together today in honor of recent cases that have brought this situation to our attention and shown us how immediate, how dire the need for awareness, for self-examination, and for being self-governed, how immediate and dire that is. I also stand not only for Native American victims, but for people of all genders, racial compositions, for the children, the victims, for example, in the Penn State episode, that cannot speak for themselves. And so, collectively, we honor you, victims and survivors of domestic violence. Thank you. If you'll please be seated. In order to continue to honor our statement against domestic violence, first we need to look at some of the characteristics, some of the patterns of the behaviors. I'm working with what was a beautiful PowerPoint. We were not able to get the facilitation with that at the last minute, so I'll be sharing verbally. This is entitled Domestic Violence Against Native Americans, and the opening epigraph is very fitful, very fitting. Relationships are the place, the playground of domestic violence. And love should not hurt is the epigraph that this opens up with. And so usually with domestic violence, we're talking about either familial relationships or relationships with partners, spouses, things such as that. According to the Cherokee Tribal Court, there have been reported 100 protective orders just this year filed by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Program. So 100 protective orders. The sad thing about those protective orders is that while they're very legally sound, they are only a piece of paper if we have a perpetrator and abuser that chooses to ignore the legality of that situation. It offers little protection. 95% of those protective orders are still active as of today. So notice a lot of times when we have those filed, they don't go away. These are ongoing problems and ongoing transitions, so we have to be ever vigilant to help the people that are trying to better their lives. This is a combination of sexual assault and domestic violence when we look at these statistics. And we know, of course, that violence takes more than just a physical dimension. It also can take the form of the sexual assault, the emotional abuse, and so there are many ways that we see those behaviors carried out. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women. Every 9 seconds a woman is assaulted or beaten. I think these statistics are in general. I'm not sure if they're nationwide, worldwide, but our source is Glendale. Every day, more than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends or their husbands. And we know it's not only male-on-female violence. I've also known cases where men had a difficult time leaving their situations in which they were being abused because of social stigmas, because they seem powerless. And it's ended up in their deaths as well. 85% of the time, physical force is used in sexual assault. 80% of the abusers are relatives, friends, neighbors, or people that know the victim. So if we figuratively take a moment to look at the people around us and say, how well do we really know the people with whom we interact every day? And if we think we know them well in a positive way, we certainly want to be thankful and celebrate those good relationships. I see from the tables that are available here to me, sexual assaults. We started in 2007. There were 211 reported here in the area. And then we had a little bit of a swell, 265 in 2009, back down so far in 2011 to 176. It's still far too great numbers, even though we do see a lessening of practice, maybe an increase in awareness. When I look at the filings for assaults versus the convictions, for example, in 2010, 2011, we had over 1,600 filings for domestic violence. Out of those, 477 convictions resulted. And so we see there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to following through with helping people with protection and transition. Some more domestic violence statistics. Native American women have the highest rate of violence of any group in the United States. Native American women also stand a higher risk at losing their children because they choose to stay with the abuser. So it's as if we almost have a system that turns on the victim, that additionally disables that victim. The Department of Justice released that Native American women suffer violent crime at a rate 3.5 times greater than the national average. And I ask myself, why? What are the causes of this? Is it because we have a hole in our cultural identity from many of the factors that Mr. Matthew Tunai spoke of earlier? Is it because domestic violence is a learned behavior? The batterers learn from watching other abusers. They learn from watching their family, their friends, popular culture, some of the blending of cultures when we look at what happened between the native peoples and the settlers back in our country's early beginnings. So as I ask myself why, I'm also looking at the characteristics. When we look specifically at sexual assault, we see that involves not only sexual harassment, it also can lead to and involves physical abuse. Oftentimes there's a lot of exploitation, sexual exploitation, either publicly or self-exploitation by the victim, because it's a very learned behavior to succumb to that treatment. We see here 47% of women are raped in their lifetime. That's almost half. So 1 out of every 2 of us sitting here, women, could face that challenge. 3/4 of American Indian women have experienced some type of sexual assault in their lives. 3/4, 75%. Most sex offenders are male. However, research indicates that 20% of sexual assault against children are by women. So we have a lot of dysfunction that's happening in our society. Sexual assaults are committed by someone of the same race as the victim usually. An exception to this fact is that people who commit sexual assault against Native American women are usually not Native American. Native American women are at least 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than other women in the United States. Well, what are some of the causes then from this practice, of this perpetration? The causes come from power and control. And so as we have that struggle between two different people, two forces, it manifests both physically and both with sexual assault. A lot of times, some of the characteristics, the practices, the traits we see, the perpetrator uses intimidation, makes the victim afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons, using emotional abuse, putting the victim down, making that person feel bad about self, calling that person names, making that person think that he or she is crazy, playing mind games, humiliating the victim, making the victim feel guilty, as if somehow that person asked for or invited the behavior. Sometimes we see the perpetrator using isolation to get that power and that control. Controlling what the victim does, who that person sees and talks to, what the person reads, where the person goes, limiting outside involvement, using jealousy to justify actions. Often the power and control comes from minimizing, denying, and blaming, making light of the abuse. Oh, you don't really have it that bad. Not taking concerns about it seriously. Oh, you know I would never really hurt you, the abuser may say. Saying the abuse didn't happen. Shifting responsibility for abusive behavior. If you'd have behaved properly, I wouldn't have had to put you in your place, that type of thing. Saying that even the person caused it. They also use the children. And remember the statistic that said Native American women were more likely to lose their children for staying with the abuser, so for trying to be loyal. Often we have the perpetrator making the victim feel guilty about the children, using those children to relay messages back and forth, using visitation to harass the victim, threatening to take the children away. So again, power and control. We even have economic abuse that enables abuse. Preventing a person from getting or keeping a job. We have that happen a lot. Making the person ask for money, giving the victim an allowance. Taking the victim's money, not letting that person know about or have access to family income. These stories are all too common, even today, in our society. And I see a lot of us that have had some experiences, know what we're talking about. Here using male, and I'm sure there's a use of female privilege, but using male privilege, it says here treating a person like a servant, making all the big decisions in the family dynamics, being the master of the castle, being the one to define the men's and women's roles, the gender roles, instead of sitting down equally and saying, what do we need to do together to take care of our family? So these are some of the practices and tactics, traits of the power and control. We do realize that often abuse is a cycle. We have a honeymoon period, we have a tension building period, and we have an explosion. And I remember my grandmother saying about my grandfather, oh, you can tell when it's coming, he gets really quiet. So as I read over these, I thought, wow, these are the same patterns. But people never told me this. I did not know until I got to undergrad and attended elements such as this, and then was able to find out a lot about healing. The 3 stages to domestic violence then. Stage 1, we have tension building. We have small physical assaults that may occur. The victim is isolated, keeps the victim away from friends and family. There's a lot of name calling involved. The victim's able to calm the abuser down by using techniques from previous encounters. Usually we go into this behavior of programming, knowing how to react, respond, so as to de-escalate the situation. The abuse victims do realize the assaults can and will eventually turn out more violent and more dangerous because we see them happening again and again, so they increase in their velocity. Victims make excuses for the abusers in their minds. Okay, this person only knows how he or she was treated as a child. So, we have to be careful to ask ourselves, where's the responsible adult? We all have to take responsibility for our behavior. The psychological stress that the victim endures during the tension-building period is brutal. It's as if you're on pins and needles, walking on eggshells all the time. Stage 2 often results in the grand explosion, verbal attacks, humiliation, the use of weapons, physical and sexual assault, even forced imprisonment. Sometimes it'll be a flashpoint of passion that ignites, and all of these things come together. Sometimes it's prolonged and even methodical application of these tactics to wear down the victim's endurance and to make that person succumb to the abuser's wishes. In this stage of explosion, nothing the victim can say or do will ease or stop the abuser's violence. There's no stopping it once it starts. It rolls to fruition. The abuser has no self-control. The abuser's often in a blind rage, doesn't even realize the damage that they're inflicting on the partner. The emotional and physical stress that the victim goes through leaves them tormented, often hospitalized, sometimes deceased. Stage 3, once we have some big explosion, and of course these are a cycle, you can see all stages happening at all times. Stage 3 is the calm and the relief period. It's also known as the honeymoon phase. The abuser begs forgiveness, promises to get help. I'll never do it again. The abuser tells the victim he or she loves them, may even cry. The abuser really has conviction about this point, probably feels what he or she is telling the victim. The tension